Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all back to our next session. That's the potpourri session. And to moderate the session, allow me to welcome Dr. Rashtriya Pujari ma'am. She is the Vice President ISNAC and Senior Consultant Anesthesiologist at the Slope Hospital and Research Center, Mumbai. I would also like to request and welcome Dr. Rashri Gandhi ma'am. She is the Head of Department Neuroanesthesiology and Neurocritical Care, Kokilaben Dhirubhai Ambani Hospital, Mumbai.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to request you to introduce the speakers with their topics, and the CVs would be displayed. Thank you.
Um, can you hear me? Shweta, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Okay.
And I'm
So,
I'm logged in with Sridhar ma'am's ID.
sorry. Okay. So, at the outset, I would like to congratulate Saurabh a lot, and I like to echo the sentiments raised by Punaya and Shashi Srivastav that in spite of so many problems, or in spite of being worried how it will go, he has started this virtual first NSCI conference, and I'm sure that it will be a great success, and it will lead to the new normal, and this new normal will probably be outlast the corona. We are waiting for corona to go away, but probably we'll have more such virtual meetings. And thank you again, Dr. Saurav, and thank you the team as well for such a wonderful conference. Let me start with the first. So this session, Popori session, has got three lectures, and we'll start with the first one by Dr. Sri Ganesh K. He's a professor in Department of Neuroanesthesia and Neurocritical Care and affiliation in the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, NIMHANS that is. Now, his topic for the day is the research gaps in TBI guidelines. And as we all know, and as according to the Head Injury Foundation of India, that India has a rather unenviable distinction of having the highest rate of head injuries in the world. And almost as high as 1 lakh of people, lives are lost. And although there is a lot of research in TBI, which is expanded for several decades, there's still a lot of gaps in the knowledge. Dr. Sri Ganesh comes from NIMHANS. NIMHANS has a history of doing a lot of research in TBI along with AIMS, and he's probably the best one to address to us about these gaps. Dr. Sri Ganesh, please.
Thank you, madam. And at the outset, let me thank Saurav and his entire team for the fantastic conference that they organized and for giving me an opportunity to speak on research gaps in traumatic brain injury guidelines. I bring greetings from NIMHANS Bangalore, and in the next 15 minutes, I will touch upon these Brain Trauma Foundation guidelines for TBI, the gaps that I could identify and present in these 15 minutes, the reason for these gaps and the potential impact of these gaps on clinical practice, and lastly, some thoughts on how to go about addressing these gaps. I'll be restricting to the neurointensive care management of severe traumatic brain injury in adults, and this is the guideline published in 2017, which has about 18 elements, 11 under the heading of treatment, 3 under the headings of monitoring, and 4 under the heading of thresholds. And apart from these elements which are available under the guidelines, there are several components of care that we practice in our neurointensive care day-to-day care of the patients, which do not find mention in these guidelines. So how are these guidelines generated? It's basically on the evidence that is available at the point of framing of the guidelines, and largely the levels are based on the quality of evidence that is available. So you have level 1 recommendation, which is based on good quality randomized control trials, and level 2B and 3 based on poor quality evidence, such as from non-comparative study designs and cohort studies. So why this is important? It's because the foundation has to be strong, good, to have a structure above it, which is well built. So if you don't have sound studies, robustly conducted primary studies, such as randomized controlled trials, it will not result in good quality guidelines or even absence of guidelines in certain components of care. So that's what is the importance of primary studies, which is to generate good quality data. So I'll take you to some of the gaps. One which is commonly encountered is polytrauma in patients with traumatic brain injury. This is a significant proportion of patients that we see in our practice. We do not currently have specific guidelines addressing some of these aspects of care. Guidelines predominantly look into isolated traumatic brain injury. While we have guidelines for adult population, pediatric population, what is lacking is elderly population, where several aspects of care are different from the adult population. And third aspect is in surgical management. There has been some progress, including the recent publication of guidelines for decompressive craniectomy, where they have included recent trials as well. And this is a concept of living guidelines. What I am focusing will be on the gaps within the available guidelines that we have and some key elements which I found to be missing. There may be several other components which the moderators and the audience will be able to identify in the existing guidelines too. But for want of time, I'll be enumerating only a few of them. But the major limitation of the current guidelines that I found was with regards to the recommendation, mostly they are negative recommendation. Do not use steroids for either reducing the ICP or improving the outcome. No role for prophylactic barbiturates, no role for hyperventilation. They tell us what not to do, but what we need in our day-to-day clinical practice is what we need to do and how to do. So for that, we need a large amount of good quality data, which is lacking in some of these critical areas, and therefore we do not have good guidelines available. So if you take the example of polytrauma with TBI, because of absence of evidence and absence of guidelines, what we have is World Society of Emergency Surgery consensus guidelines, where they inform us how to monitor and manage a patient with severe adult traumatic brain injury with polytrauma in the first 24 hours. So the management is slightly different because of the impact of polytrauma on TBI outcome as well. So here on the left side, we have some thresholds which we need to maintain in patients with polytrauma and associated traumatic brain injury. And on the right side, we have how to approach a patient with brain injury with existing polytrauma. The second research gap I found is with regards to the elderly population. The guidelines are absent because the primary studies are absent. There is significant underrepresentation of elderly population in TBI research. Most of the RCTs have to be homogeneous population, and therefore they exclude patients above 60 or 65 and below 18, and to exclude some of the confounding variables. Second is the assessment and impact of pre-injury functional status of elderly patients and the impact of elderly brain in the outcome of traumatic brain injury. These needs to be understood, and then only we can have some data on these individuals. And lastly, absence of geriatric specific data elements. For example, we have some target for systolic blood pressure in traumatic brain injury in patients 70 and above years of age. But similar thresholds are not available for ICP or CPP, and whether do we need separate thresholds? These are some of the questions which are unanswered in the current guidelines. Likewise, for monitoring, interventions are likely to be different in elderly with coexisting problems. And lastly, the prognosis and futility of care needs to be understood in detail in elderly population as compared to the adult and pediatric population. So these are the current knowledge gaps that we have in current guidelines. If you look at the surgical management, the guidelines that are available right from 2006, where they focused on indications for mass lesions, then moved on to not recommending decompressive craniectomy to improve outcomes in the 2017 guidelines for diffuse injury. And only last month, we have updated recommendations with regards to decompressive craniectomy, and it recommends performing decompressive craniectomy for late refractory ICP elevation to improve mortality and outcomes. So this is the advantage of having a living guidelines concept, wherein as and when the new evidence emerges, in this particular case, it is with regards to the rescue ICP trial and DECRA trial, which provided sound evidence for making new recommendations. These are not available for all elements of care, and there is a need for filling those gaps, especially with regards to osmotherapy. The current guideline informs or continues rather of the recommendations made in the third edition of the guidelines to use mannitol to reduce ICP in the dose of 0.25 to 1 gram per kg. However, in the recent years, a lot of new evidence has emerged, especially with regards to hypertonic saline, and where they have found, if not superior, it is equivalent to mannitol with regards to reduction of ICP and improving outcomes. So here, living evidence guidelines would have helped in implementing some of the research findings into clinical practice. I will go through some of the existing guidelines and then find out if there are some gaps in these, and then how we can address these. So if you look at the CSF drainage, the recommendation is to perform them to reduce ICP. However, patients with severe traumatic brain injury is likely to have a slit ventricle, or where CSF drainage may be extremely difficult, can lead to multiple attempts, complications such as seizure, injury, and bleeding, infections. So these are the harms that are associated with certain interventions which are recommended. And if these harms, how do they affect the outcomes? These are not answered clearly in the current guidelines. If you look at ventilation guidelines, currently we have only PaCO2 less than 25 should be avoided, especially in the early phase of injury. What about PaO2? What about the role of PEEP in improving oxygenation? What about lung protective ventilation, especially when TBI is associated with systemic effects on the pulmonary system? So these remain unanswered. Similarly, for analgesic sedatives, alternatives are not discussed. Nutrition, we don't know how to approach. Anti-epileptic drugs, alternative such as levetiracetam is increasingly used in clinical practice. That does not find clear-cut recommendations in the guidelines. But what is striking is with regards to the gaps in guidelines for DVT prophylaxis. We know we have to use mechanical prophylaxis, but when it comes to pharmacological, what is the drug, what is the dose, what is the route, and when to start and stop these anticoagulants remains unanswered in the current guidelines. Similarly, for infection prophylaxis, I will deal with it separately. When you look at the guidelines with regards to thresholds and monitoring, you find that these are the numbers that are available to us. Systolic blood pressure less than 100 should be avoided. ICP should be below 22, and CPP it should be between 60 and 70, and jugular venous oxygen saturation less than 50 should be avoided. But the guidelines do not discuss newly available techniques, alternatives to monitor and manage these thresholds, and how importantly, how to achieve and maintain these thresholds, like blood pressure, whether we go with vasopressors, whether we go with inotropes, because we know emerging evidence suggests that cardiac dysfunction is also associated with traumatic brain injury, and inotropes improving cardiac output itself may improve cerebral perfusion. But these remain unanswered in the current guidelines, and these are the gaps that we need to fix it in the future with emerging evidence. Similarly, for monitoring, harms of monitoring remains unanswered, and monitoring itself, there is evidence to suggest that it leads to increased duration of ICU and hospital stay, and during the intervening period, there are several other confounding factors that come into play which can affect the outcome. So these are not catered to in the current guidelines. Then what is left out in the current guidelines? There are certain aspects which I have listed here. It is not comprehensive. This is what came to my mind during the preparation of the presentation. We are all anesthesiologists to begin with, and we don't know whether intravenous anesthesia or inhalation anesthesia is better in patients with traumatic brain injury with regards to long-term outcomes or even short-term outcomes. Similarly, with the fluids, we know that we should not be using hypotonic fluids or glucose-containing fluids, but whether balanced solutions are better with regards to fluid management in these patients, what are the targets, whether liberal fluid approach or restricted intake approach is superior. These are again the gaps that needs to be addressed. Dedicated neurointensive care unit versus general intensive care management of patients with traumatic brain injury. There is some evidence, but again, they have not found place in the guidelines. Infection prevention, what has been addressed in the guidelines is regards to tracheostomy. Early tracheostomy is better. Antibiotic impregnated catheters for external ventricular drain is to be considered. But with regards to bloodstream infection, urinary tract infection, other reasons for ventilator-associated pneumonia, these also affect outcomes in traumatic brain injury patients. But we do not know how to go about managing, or we do not know the impact of these secondary issues in traumatic brain injury. Similarly, systemic injury is quite common in patients with traumatic brain injury. In our own study at NIMHANS, we found that about 12% of the patients with traumatic brain injury have associated acute kidney injury. Again, and this has been shown to affect the outcomes in terms of hospital stay, mortality, ventilator duration. But the current guidelines do not cater to the requirements of day-to-day care of patients with traumatic brain injury adequately. Early cognitive intervention and rehabilitation is increasingly being considered in traumatic brain injury patients. Probably in future, the guidelines will address some of these aspects as well. These are some of the gaps currently we have. And also the role of pre-existing comorbidities, which is completely silent. The current guidelines are completely silent on this issue as well. When it comes to thresholds, we have ICP threshold, we have CPP threshold, we have blood pressure threshold. These are important. Apart from these, if you look at the what is mentioned here, sodium, hemoglobin, albumin, PaO2, glucose, these independently affect outcomes in traumatic brain injury. We don't know what is the threshold for transfusion in traumatic brain injury, what is the target for hemoglobin in traumatic brain injury. And in absence of this, the practices are individualized based on the patient requirement, hospital protocol, and their own insight and experiences with clinical practice. And lastly, neurointensive care is all about monitoring. Currently, we have only ICP and CPP with regards to the brain. Even for systemic parameters, there is no mention about targets in traumatic brain injury guidelines. Biomarkers, a lot of research is currently being done on this topic. Maybe in future, this will translate into some meaningful information for clinical practitioners of traumatic brain injury. The main drawback of the guidelines is the absence of good quality data. For traumatic brain injury in India, we don't have currently a national database regarding traumatic brain injury. I think we should have something like this coronavirus, what we learned from this experience. We have at least some data regarding daily incidents of traumatic brain injury and COVID occurrence throughout the country. I think we should focus something on these lines for traumatic brain injury as well. The priorities have to change. We should understand the magnitude of the problem, the importance of the problem, and the consequences of this problem of traumatic brain injury. Only then we will be able to impress upon the stakeholders, the patient, the public, the policymakers, the granting agencies, clinicians, researchers, etc. All of them should be part of generating the data so that we can care for our patients better than what we are currently doing. Now, the potential reasons for these gaps are listed here. As I said, the stakeholders are not clearly realizing the importance. There is gap in implementation. Information, though it is understood, is not translated into some actionable tasks. Funding is inadequate, and therefore we are not able to conduct large, good quality studies. A lack of data, again I mentioned, we don't even have the parliament reply given by the government says that we don't know how many doctors died because of COVID-19. So we can only imagine the deaths because of traumatic brain injury in India every year. Primary studies are the backbone of guidelines. So if you don't have good primary studies, or they are few in number, you cannot make guidelines based on those. Similarly, the quality of research, if it is poor, and it is difficult. We understand that RCTs sometimes ethically not permissible, are challenging to be performed. Even when they are conducted, they are small sample size, and majority of the studies are restricted to phenomenological outcomes, like looking at the ICP, looking at the CPP, looking at hospital stay, and not long-term return to work, quality of life, etc. And if you look at even the studies, majority are retrospective or at best prospective observational. RCTs again are few in number. And lastly, the reason for these gaps is heterogeneity of the disease process itself, which leads to differential care, and therefore it becomes difficult to compare, and which therefore in turn results in non-availability of guidelines in management. So what is the impact of these gaps? The magnitude of the problem remains unknown. Understanding of the disease process remains incomplete. The comprehensive high quality care is not possible, and therefore when these are not timely, the translation of research into clinical practice is impeded. So how do we address these? Identification of the gaps is crucial, the first step in the process itself. And then we have to develop robust data. It should be multi-centric, good quality primary studies need to be conducted, and then the fallback on living guidelines concept. Don't wait for 5 years for the guidelines to be presented and then to be practiced. And when these guidelines are missing based on evidence, we have to look for consensus guidelines which can help the practitioner in the remotest place who manages traumatic brain injury. There is evidence to suggest that when the quality of evidence is poor, adherence to the guidelines is also poor. So we have to strive to improve the quality of studies that we do to translate the research into clinical practice. Before I conclude, we should remember that when there are no gaps, when the evidence is available, when guidelines are clear, we should not be making any poor decisions. Like we know the steroids should not be used, but there are still some centers in peripheries where you choose steroids. PaCO2 less than 25 is not good. We know that, but still there are we allow some of our patients who breathe spontaneously to have a PaCO2 levels below this. But where gap exists, we need to use common sense. We know the recommendations say use mannitol, but if the BP systolic blood pressure is 80 and ICP is a 40, we should use common sense and use a better agent in that scenario, such as hypertonic saline would be more prudent to be used rather than mannitol in such situations. To summarize, knowledge gap exists for several aspects of TBI care. Even where guidelines are available, the quality of evidence is poor. We need to focus more on elements, various elements of care, and more clarity within the existing elements of guidelines. We all acknowledge that it is difficult to generate guidelines because of the heterogeneity of TBI itself and the processes involved in the care of these patients. However, plugging these guidelines, plugging these gaps in these guidelines is likely to result in benefits to the patients. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sri Ganesh, for focusing the gaps and drawing our attention to all what is required to do. And I think forming societies like the NCSI will go in a big way so that, you know, more and more people are dealing with the patients who are indigenous to us and not really blindly following the guidelines and doing much more research. Thank you. The questions will be taken in the later part of the
Okay, thank you, madam. Thank you.
Can I have a slide of Dr. Dheeraj? Yeah, I would like to welcome Dr. Dheeraj Masapo. He is consultant neuroanesthesiologist and in charge of neuroanesthesia and neurointensive care at Sakra Wild Hospital, Bangalore. He will be speaking on role of neurophysiologic monitoring in neuro-ICU. We all, as a neuroanesthesiologist and critical care consultants, know how important is the neurophysiological monitoring. It has really expanded this whole decade. And prior to this all, we were all dependent on the clinical examinations and look for the subtle changes in the patient. But with this neurophysiology, definitely we are achieving what we need to, and we can restrict the deterioration of the patient before it happens. Thank you very much. Over to Dr. Dheeraj.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'll be talking about the role of evoked potential monitoring in neurointensive care unit. Thank you, Saurabh sir, for giving this opportunity. So I'll be covering topics like reticular activating system mapping and stroke prognostication, evoked potentials in post-cardiac arrest, and vasospasm and evoked potentials. Evoked potentials in spine, I'm not covering in this topic. It will be exceeding the time limit. So actually, how I started this evoked potentials in neurocritical care is with this common scenario that we face in neurocritical care day in and day out. So elderly gentleman comes to neurocritical care with a low GCS of M2, and his pupils will be bilateral and sluggishly reacting to light. So he'll be diagnosed with a chronic acute subdural hematoma, and decompressive surgery will be done. Post surgery, we'll shift him to neuro ICU, and after a few days, we'll do a tracheostomy, and we'll start weaning from the ventilator. But still, his GCS will be low. So the relatives or patient attendants will be asking only two questions to me. So when is he going to recover? So when is the consciousness going to come back? If he becomes conscious, is his limb function going to improve? These are the two questions they'll be asking me. So basically, they're asking me to prognosticate the situation. Then I started reading about the consciousness. So I came to know it is mainly controlled by the reticular activating system in the brain. So little bit about the anatomy of reticular activating system. So reticular activating system is mainly located in the reticular formation, which is located in the brainstem. There are two components of reticular formation. One is the upper reticular formation and the lower reticular formation. So here you can see better. So this is where the reticular formation, one second. So reticular formation is basically located in the brainstem. From there, the circuits reach the thalamus. From there, the circuits will go to different parts of the cerebral cortex. So there are studies being done to identify the reticular formation by using diffusion tensor imaging sequences in the MRI. And this is how it looks in the DTI sequencing. So basically that is the lower RAS, and upper RAS is from the thalamus to the parietal cortex as well as the frontal cortex. It will be going. This is one of the case example where the patient was having a right-sided contusion, and in the reticular formation there was a thalamic component damage. This patient couldn't make to conscious level in the long term. And this is another situation where diffuse axonal injury was there, and in the DTI sequence, they could see a thalamic component was damaged, and even this patient couldn't make to the conscious level. So another study was done to assess correlate the GCS scores with the reticular activating system volume, and they found that the lower reticular activating system, which is located in the brainstem, is mainly correlating with the consciousness of the people. Upper ARAS did not correlate with the consciousness. And it is actually correlating with some of the studies done by Merker et al. They told that the thalamocortical system is not actually associated with consciousness. The RAS, which is located in the brainstem, is the one which is responsible for the consciousness. So based on this theoretical background, what hypothesis that I made is, you can see in this diagram. So reticular RAS is located in the brainstem, which is responsible for consciousness. So the motor tracts will be going in front of that, and the sensory tracts will be going behind that. So motor tracts are mainly assessed by the MEPs, we all know that, and sensory tracts are assessed by the SSCP. And we can see in the image the reticular formation. In the anterior reticular formation, there is inferior colliculus and a superior olivary nucleus, which form the component of brainstem auditory evoked responses. Mainly the fourth and fifth waveform complex and third wave are actually relating to these nuclei. So by assessing the BERA also, we can actually so the concept, that hypothesis that I made is, indirectly by assessing the structures which are present surrounding the RAS, if they are intact, so we can assume that the RAS also might be intact in that particular patient, and he can make up to the conscious level in future. So these are some of the case examples that I have done in my center. Is that there was a left thalamic bleed, patient presented with GCS of motor response of M4 and right-sided weakness. So this is how I set up my MEPs in the ICU. And what I observed is the right-sided MEPs were absent, and SSCP also was absent on the right side. So what kind of inference I am trying to gain is, so bilateral RAS is required for consciousness recovery. So this patient might have damaged RAS in the thalamus level or in the brainstem level. So he might not make up to consciousness level. That is what I told the relatives. And even if he recovers, because MEPs are absent, he might not develop limb function in future. This is another case of frontal contusion. When patient presented, his GCS was M2, but I could get good MEPs on bilaterally. So then I assured the family that they have to go for aggressive rehabilitation, which they did. And after 3 months, patient became M6, and I could see a good MEPs in all the limbs. SSCP was catching artifacts in ICU. So you can see the M2 and M6 MEPs. The amplitudes of MEPs in the M6 are better and increased in size. So basically, in this case, what I inferred is, if bilateral MEP and SSCP are present, then actually we can assure the family to go for aggressive rehabilitation and give confidence to them, which they did in our hospital. After 3 months, patient could improve. And the amplitude of MEPs also matter. If the amplitude increases, you can actually prognosticate that that patient might be improving. And this is a very common scenario which came recently, right side acute subdural hematoma. And patient GCS was M2. People were very sluggishly reacting. But I got bilateral SSCP and bilateral MEP in this patient. So I told the relatives, I assured them that he is going to recover in near term. And after 3 weeks, I got him to ICU and again checked his sensorium. It has improved to M4 from M2. And his pupils started reacting to light. And the patient was wincing to pain and showing some expressions on his face. And that time I did his MEPs after 3 weeks, which showed increase in the amplitude of MEPs, and SSCPs are good. And also this time I did brainstem auditory evoked responses. which you can see in the left side up top image. There, even the Bera third and fourth and fifth complex was present on one side. So I gave again assurance to the patient family to continue the supportive care for the patient. So he might recover in the future. So this is about consciousness reversal. In stroke, we mainly have to prognosticate the motor recovery. That is the main thing. And one more important thing is, some people, even if they go to rehabilitation, the hand power might not improve. So, but with MEP, what we can tell is, if the MEP is present in that particular limb, so we actually advise them to go for a more aggressive rehabilitation programs, so that there is a possibility of that hand going to improve in future. So there are studies which are done on correlating the MEP and SSCP and motor recovery in stroke, and they showed that a good MEP waveform, if an SSCP, if it is present, there is a good probability of patient recovering. A systematic review was done on 14 trials, including 482 patients, and they concluded that a good MEP and SSCP waveform, if patients are having in the baseline, those patients actually recovered with aggressive rehabilitation programs in the future. And coming to SAH and evoked potentials, so the prognostic value in this study, they showed that normal evoked potentials usually indicate a favorable outcome, and unilateral or bilateral loss in SSCP and brainstem evoked responses usually indicates a poorer prognosis for the patients. And this is another study where the SSCPs have been done on high-grade SAH patients. What they concluded is that SSCP, median of SSCP and posterior tibial SSCP done at 2 weeks from the ictus correlated with the long-term outcome of the SAH patients. And next, coming to prognostication of cardiac arrest. This is well-known fact. Absent N20 cortical response shows that the patient is brain dead. But what I am trying to convey is, in ROSC people who are not brain dead, so by looking at the N20, if the N20 waveform is present, so there is a possibility that that patient is going to survive and get discharged in future. And if it is not present, even though he has some bit of spontaneous breathing, so you can think of withdrawing the life support in future for that particular patient. You can take crucial decisions based on the evoked potentials. And now in animal experiments, what they're trying to do is derive a new parameter called as quantitative SSCP monitoring. These are 2 studies which are working on that, and they are saying they're correlating well with the post-cardiac arrest situation. And what they see is called as phase space area in the quantitative SSCP. And in rats, a study was done. It correlates well with the post-cardiac arrest recovery in future. And spine surgery, I didn't cover in this particular presentation, but this is one of my publication. Post-operatively, patient after the surgery developed some weakness, and I have done MEP monitoring for that patient, and compared to baseline, which I took intraoperatively, it is decreased. So then immediately we did an MRI and found there was a problem, and we dealt it with re-exploration. Patient improved after the procedure. So it can even be used in the spine surgery cases also. And even I'm trying to do it in spinal cord injury as well in different situations. So what I learned in the process of doing since 1.5 to 2 years is, you need to apply all modalities of neuromonitoring to understand the situation of the patient and correlate that with the clinical as well as radiological data. And then you try to prognosticate, not based on one simple thing. And acute stage of the disease is not a good time to monitor, which was a mistake I did sometimes, because in acute stage of the disease, things change dynamically in the brain. So you need to wait for some days. So at least a week's time to prognosticate the patients. Follow-up is the key, which we have proactively need to do. And we need to collect the data. We need to call the patient and his relatives. And we need to explain the importance of this to treating consultants like neurologists and neurosurgeons, because this is a new field actually coming up. And then only it is possible. And sedation requirements are less than what we actually imagine. You might be thinking, might be giving a big dose in the ICU, but actually a very low dose of Dexam or fentanyl I'll be using in the ICU. And next, adding more data like DTI to see the structure of RAS, and adding functionality with MEP would be a better model to prognosticate, which I'll be doing in future. And magnetic MEPs are the best to do, because magnetic MEP doesn't require any kind of sedation or analgesia. So that they can be done in OPD basis. So if a center has this, then it will be very useful to prognosticate. Thank you very much for patient listening.
Congratulations, Dr. Dheeraj. You made the topic so simple, and I fully agree that we need multimodal monitoring it's not only the monitoring, but clinical examination is also very important. And it is going to help all the critical care specialists to communicate with the patients about the prognosis. Thank you very much, Dheeraj.
Thank you, madam.
Am I audible?
Rima.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, is it okay? Yeah. It's my proud privilege to introduce to you Dr. Shubal Dikshit from Pune. He's a consultant and ICU in charge of Sanjeevan Hospital and very well renowned. And as we know, adequate nutritional therapy is very, very important in a critical care patient. It forms a big pillar of all their therapy. So how does it differ in a neurological patient is what we are going to hear from Dr. Dikshit. So please start your talk.
Outside, I thank Neurocritical Care Society and Saurabh to invite me to talk on this topic. So I'll just start sharing my screen. So practically, let's go why nutrition is important. And we know that all critically ill patients are in a hypercatabolic state. And the hypercatabolic state, they are almost in a rapid state of malnourishment, and 50% of these patients are almost malnourished, whether they are traumatic brain injury, massive strokes, or any other critically ill patients. And inadequate nutrition increases the morbidity, mortality, as well as the length of hospital stay. And muscle wasting is one of the most important hallmark, and therefore nutrition support is very important care for all patients who are admitted into neurointensive care. The calorie deprivation is very, very harmful. You can see here from the chart that you have to start feeding the patients right from admission, because if you don't feed the patients adequately, and if the calorie deprivation count goes down to more than 10,000 kilocalories, then definitely the increased chances of infection and the length of hospital stay or ICU stay is more, as compared to if the caloric deprivation, cumulative calorie and energy deprivation is less than 10,000 kilocalories. So please, you have to start feeding the patients right on day one of hospital admissions, when the patient is hemodynamically stable and when we have achieved the fluid optimization into these patients. The demand supply gap is very important, and therefore in order to maintain nutrition support into all these patients, the timing of support is very important. And early feeding is the key for better outcomes. And the demand supply gap definitely goes on increasing as and when the Apache scores, the SOFA score, or the Nutri scores goes on increasing. And we have to see that the demand supply gap is almost narrow and they are together with each other, so that definitely the cumulative energy deficit does not widen, and therefore the morbidity or the mortality does not increase. The impact of malnourishment you can see here. You can see if you deprive the patients, these patients are going to be deprived of proteins and calories. There's going to be a lean body mass which is going to go down. The muscle wasting occurs, and almost about 900 grams of muscle mass can be lost on day one itself, on per day. And because of this, there will be poor wound healing. The surgical scars will not heal properly. These patients can also be difficult to wean, and the impaired ventilating capacities. They may have organ dysfunction. Immune system is compromised, and these patients can then further progress into multiple organ failure and SIRS. Therefore, early optimization of enteral nutrition support, and if you cannot achieve the goals by enteral nutrition support, you have to give them combined or supplemental parenteral nutrition support. I'll be speaking about the specialized or the immunonutrition therapy, which plays a very important role into the CNS kind of populations, which is currently as per the guidelines. So delayed nutrition is also increases the length of hospital stay, not only into the ICU, but also into the neurocritical wards, and therefore you have to feed the patients there also, not only into the intensive care units. And the risk assessment should be started right from day one, because if you don't assess the nutrition properly, then definitely the mortality and the morbidity is going to go up, because you'll not know exactly which patients need aggressive nutrition support. And this nutrition score assessment has to be done by means of various systems which are available. We have also got the NRS system, we have got the Nutri score, we have got the subjective global assessment, and more importantly, the indirect calorimetry. But indirect calorimetry is time consuming, is slightly costly, and not all hospitals have it available easily into the intensive care units. So the most easy way to calculate nutrition support is with the help of Nutri score, and even the guidelines recommend that all patients who are admitted to the intensive care unit, they have to be screened within the first 48 hours with the help of Nutri score, and higher the Nutri score, more aggressive nutrition support needs to be given into these patients. As I said, indirect calorimetry is one of the best way to determine it, but it is time consuming, it is slightly costly, and definitely it is not available into all hospitals. So the easy way is with the help of with the help of Nutri-Score. So giving nutrition right from admission is very important, because an ounce of prevention is definitely better than the pound of cure. So nutrition management mainly is with the help of enteral nutrition support. And this enteral nutrition can be given by a source of nutrition, which is a combination of carbohydrates, lipids, amino acids, electrolytes, vitamins, as well as trace elements. Definitely having a combination together is much more important than, because if you use combination of carbohydrate, lipids, and proteins, then we can have a good glycemic control. And that is one of the hallmark also into these patients into neurotrauma unit or neurointensive care. The requirements are not much different from other critically ill patients. You have to initiate them with proteins of about 1 to 1.5 grams of per kg body weight with about 25 to 30 kilocalories of energy. And definitely combination of glucose with lipids and vitamin minerals plays a very important role, and especially into those trauma patients where glutamine levels are very much on the lower side, you can consider to use initial levels of glutamine, especially if the renal functions are normal and if the patients are not in shock, along with omega-3 fatty acids or fish oils into the populations of traumatic brain injury patients. The formulas what we use is about 50% of glucose with 30% of fat and 20% of proteins, but you need to subjectively change depending upon the Nutri-Score. You also need to take into consideration the liver functions, the kidney functions, what are there. And if the stress factor is quite high, definitely certain patients may also require about proteins of approximately about 2 grams of per kg body weight, and try to achieve 80% of the calorie goals within the first 72 hours. As I said, enteral nutrition is the key into neuro-intensive care units. It is much more easy. We have to use the gut. It is much more cheaper. It preserves the gut mucosa and avoids the bacterial translocation of bacteria from the gut, and thus avoids secondary infections. And this is more physiological. It is much more easy to feed the patients also. So this is just a chart of how you should feed into neuro-intensive care units. And this is at admission, you have to screen all patients and see whether the patient is hemodynamically stable. The hemodynamic stability is achieved by means of, one, the fluids have been optimized. And if the patient is in shock, if the patient is on vasopressors, then there has to be a decreasing doses of vasopressors. And you have to assess whether enteral nutrition support can be started. If enteral nutrition support can be started, definitely you have to give a gastric challenge with a full strength of concentration. Do not hesitate to check for return kind of fluids, and do not avoid to feed the patients. Continue to feed the patients with the help of prokinetics using metoclopramide or erythromycin. And you have to achieve and try to achieve 80% of the calorie goals with the help of enteral nutrition support within the first 72 hours. Only if you cannot achieve enteral nutrition support within the first 72 hours, then the deficit number of calories can be bridged or can be made up with the help of giving parenteral nutrition, which is now called as supplemental parenteral nutrition or partial parenteral nutrition. So the concept of total parenteral nutrition has moved away from TPN to partial parenteral nutrition or supplemental parenteral nutrition, which plays a very important role. And thus, a combination of enteral as well as parenteral nutrition support plays very important. And this is important because we don't want to have a cumulative energy deficit to go on increasing so as to increase the morbidity as well as mortality. I mean to say that definitely if you have started them on partial parenteral or supplemental parenteral nutrition support, always try to achieve the enteral nutrition support to more than 80% of the calorie goals. Once you have achieved more than 80% of the calorie goals, definitely you can stop the supplemental parenteral nutrition support. And you have to monitor these patients with electrolytes, a meticulous glycemic control to keep a sugar reasonably well under control between 150 to 180. You have to adjust the pro-motility agents because using continuous prokinetics can also precipitate diarrhea. And into those patients where if you find that the patient is definitely aspirating, if it's absolutely the high chances of the GCS is very poor, you can also consider to use a post-pyloric kind of feeding so as to avoid further aspirations into these patients. Very few subset of patients who will benefit from parenteral nutrition. Those have got a real abnormal gut functions, but in CNS, this is quite different. These patients have got a normal gut functions, and therefore you don't need to use much amount of total parenteral nutrition into any kind of trauma patients, excepting if it's going to be a polytrauma case where there is a liver lacerations, intestinal lacerations, along with a traumatic brain injury or with along with the traumatic brain injury. Or this is the one area which is much more different from the normal intensive care units practices, where not much amount of parenteral nutrition support plays an important role. Only some part of partial parenteral nutrition support can be used only if you cannot feed the patients with the help of enteral nutrition support. Various sugar control studies have been done. The intensive insulin therapy done by Geert Vandenberg, the tight glucose study which was done, which was backed up by the nice sugar levels. All of them have different ideas where the intensive insulin therapy said a rigid control of 80 to 110, but they may included patients into the post-operative post-CABG patients. But the various studies, and even in the paper which we published as one of the authors along with the intensive care and the ISCCM colleagues, that now the sugar level should be kept reasonably well under control, which were published in IGCCM. And the reasonable level is between 150 to 180 milligrams per cent, no matter whether you're dealing with a traumatic brain injury or you're dealing with a massive stroke into neurointensive care or a neurotrauma unit. What do the guidelines say? That the guidelines say, yes, you can start feeding the patients even into neurointensive care once the patient's hemodynamic stability has been achieved, once the patient has been adequately fluid resuscitated, if the patient is hemodynamically unstable, if you find that the mean arterial pressure is less than 60, definitely withhold feeds, because this is the time when mesenteric ischemia is going to occur, and that's at what time the gastric paralysis can also occur, intestinal paralysis can occur, and therefore the chances of regurgitation is going to be high. So once you have achieved the hemodynamic stability by increasing the blood pressure, and once you have a good fluid optimization, once you have got a decreasing doses of vasoactive agents, that is the time what is defined as a hemodynamic stability, you can start initiating the patients on enteral nutrition support. Even severe nutrition deficiencies, as per the guidelines, have said that if there is a weight loss of more than 10 to 15% within 6 months, or if the subjective global assessment is grade 3, or the albumin levels is less than 3 grams per cent, but mind you, serum albumin is just one indicator, and serum albumin, the pre-albumin level plays a very important role, and there has to be no evidence of hepatic or renal dysfunctions. But more important for us is the subjective global assessment and the Nutrix score. And all patients have to be fed right within the first 24 hours once they've admitted and been into the intensive care unit. As I said here into the guidelines here, the first assessment needs to be done by all patients within 48 hours with the help of Nutrix score, which takes into consideration the interleukin-6 levels, if now they're easily available, the amount of days which is spent into nutrition, the stress factor which is being kept into there, what the age of the patients, and the points are given as 0, 1, 2, 3. And if the score is more than 6, it means a higher Nutrix score. That means the patient requires more aggressive nutrition support. This Nutrix score needs to be judged at least by every 48 to 72 hours by means of a dietitian, because you may have an initial stroke patients who may worsen, later on may undergo a craniotomy, later on may require ventilation, and therefore the stress factor goes on increasing, and as a result of which the nutrition requirements may also go on varying, and as a result of which it's a very easy way to handle nutrition support and plan the nutrition prescription as and when with the help of Nutri-Score, so that proper nutrition calories can be delivered to the patients to achieve a better nutrition goal and a better outcome to reduce the morbidity and the mortality. The general recommendations, you start off with about 25 to 30 kilocalories. The target is to achieve about 80% of the calorie goals within about first 72 hours. And if you cannot supplement them, definitely bridge it with the help of partial parenteral or supplemental parenteral nutrition support. Give proteins about 1.5 to sometimes even up to 2 grams of per kg body weight, and higher requirements also may be required for protein, especially if you are dealing with a trauma or a polytrauma patients, you may be required a higher nutrition support. Which is the route of feeding? The route of feeding is mainly enteral nutrition support into neurotrauma units. And if I see that the patient do not aspirate, do not regurgitate, and the requirements have to be calculated, and only use supplementary parenteral nutrition support, those who cannot achieve the enteral nutrition support, if you cannot meet the calorie goals within it. The preferred route is mainly consistent with whether, depending upon how much amount of nutrition support, and even the guidelines say that more consistent is with the help of enteral nutrition support, it should be given. Now, which is the preferred as per the guidelines in 2009, the 2012, and even in 2016, they have suggested that you have to use enteral nutrition support, and their morbidity and mortality is less into the group where enteral nutrition support is mainly given, and you do not require any parenteral nutrition support into these subset of patients. Exclusive parenteral nutrition has got a big no. Only supplemental parenteral nutrition plays a very important role, and the results have also shown that supplemental parenteral nutrition is very, very important. The needs of the patient, how they should be given. All patients should be given standard polymeric formula feeds, which are much more different from the kitchen feeds, which are important. And why you have to use this? These have been backed up by various kind of studies. The kitchen feeds are much more different because they have been prepared exactly in what duration you don't know. Second, you don't know what is the exact calorie content and the protein content of it. Third, the viscosity is quite high. And fifth, they're also known to cause a tube amount of the rice tube or the jejunal tube kind of blocking which can occur into it. And the bacterial content of these can also be very high as compared to the standard polymeric commercially available formula feeds, which definitely you should prepare the feeds with the help of the scoops which have been given by the pharmaceutical industry along with the tin, so that exactly you know how much amount of calories are being delivered to the patients and you can calculate it. The bacterial content is also less, and it will also help you to prepare a certain amount of good nutrition support. Secondly, you must remember that when these feeds are prepared, see that the hanging time of the fluids, whether you are giving with a feeding bag or with a hanging bag, see that the hanging time of the prepared fluid is not more than 8 hours. Otherwise, you need to prepare a fresh feed every time. And therefore, the bacterial content is also less into these standard polymeric formula feeds. And as a result of which, these standard polymeric formula feeds, the viscosity is maintained. They do not cause much amount of diarrhea. The tube clogging is also not there. And definitely these are much more better. So they have to use with standard polymeric formula feeds. Mind you, diarrhea is not always caused because of the feeds. It could also be caused because itself of the increased use of the prokinetics or the promotility agents. You need to adjust it and also need to rule out the various antibiotic or the Clostridium difficile infection if the patient of neurotrauma has been in intensive care unit for a long period of time, and if the patient has got secondary infections and has been on multiple antibiotics for a multiple amount of time. So the guidelines also say that you start using it with the help of the enteral nutrition support. You should use it. The gastric feeds also can be started. And more importantly, the rationale is especially in burns, head injury, and trauma patients, enteral nutrition support plays a very, very important role. All patients, you should give 80% of the calorie goals within the first 72 to 72 hours. And if you cannot give it, definitely bridge it with the help of partial parenteral nutrition support. Start feeding them with 1.2 to 2 grams of per kg body weight, and especially higher calories also may be required if you have a polytrauma patients or in patients with multiple fractures along with a neurotrauma or a polytrauma patients. So important thing is the monitoring. Once you have started, you have to see for the gastric distension. I'm not going to go into the details of placement of the rice tube because all of us are very important. And if you find that certain amount of gastric distension is occurred, you can easily switch over to continuous feeding with the help of a feeding pump or with the infusion pump. And enteral feedings, definitely, as I said, not all diarrheas are caused because of feed. You should rule out a Clostridium difficile infection. Also evaluate the various drugs, the pro-motility agents, which have been also given into these subset of patients. Standard polymeric formulas are the keys for using it. And certain disease formula, specific formulas also available, especially if you have a neurotrauma case along with a COPD patient that you don't want. You have to give high amount of protein, but not much amount of carbohydrates because you don't want the carbon dioxide content to go up so that it doesn't become a difficult to wean kind of patients. Or if you have also got a renal failure patients along with a neuro consideration or neuro intensive care, definitely you don't want to give more number of fluids to that patient. Then here the lipid content can also go up because lipids are known to give about 9 kilocalories, and therefore definitely that will give you more amount of calories with less amount of fluid, so that you need to do certain amount of disease specific calculations and subjective assessments into these. But mind you, feeding with standard polymeric formulas is very important into any intensive care units or neurotrauma units. In the medical ICUs, if you see, the use of immunomodulatory agents have not been useful. They have not been recommended into those patients of burns or in patients of sepsis, septic shock, because they are known to precipitate renal failure and cannot be used in septic shock. But mind you, there have been special considerations, and it still is being reserved for patients with traumatic brain injury, or in those patients of a massive kind of stroke, or in those patients where the initial glutamine levels because of traumatic brain injury on these high kind of massive kind of strokes are said to be on the lower side. So it should be started early if required, but mind you, before initiating it, special consideration is the patient should not be in shock, and the patients again should not be into renal dysfunction, that the serum creatinine value has to be normal. This is one change which is different from the medical intensive care units. Again, in feeding here, as I said, the upper into those patients, the feeding is mainly to the upper gastrointestinal tract, and whether you're supposed to use a special kind of peptides or again polymeric standard formula feeds into these patients. Mind you, only these formulations should be used with standard polymeric formula feeds, and partially digested foods or partially digested fibers should be reserved for those patients who have got persistent diarrhea. Do not use these agents just because you want to avoid a diarrhea, or in case if you suspect a malabsorption, that is a time when you are supposed to use a special kind of partially digested or soluble fiber or small kind of peptide feeds, or even the fermentable soluble fiber additives, which are the fructooligosaccharides. You can be added as supplemental. They can be divided into divided doses. They can be put into the rice tube. But this again, if there is evidence of persistent diarrhea, mind you, not for all patients who are there into neurointensive care units or neurotrauma units. If you have persistent diarrhea, once you have ruled out and you suspect a Clostridium difficile infection and there is no evidences of any infection, then that's the time you can consider. And if you're thinking of a malabsorption, then is the time when you can use these small peptides or partially peptide foods. Adjuvant therapy is very important. All patients have to be supplemented with the help of vitamin C because of the immunomodulatory effects and anti-inflammatory effects, vitamin C, ascorbic acid, trace elements because they are very important in the form of zinc, selenium, copper, because they also improve the outcome again in burns and critical care illness, because certain these patients also remain on ventilator for a long period of time. These can also be one of these deficiencies can also be one of the causes for difficult to wean or delayed kind of feeding. So for all patients, I need to be supplemented with the help of antioxidants and trace elements into these patients. So the take home message is you have to assess all patients, start enteral nutrition support as much as possible early. You have to start achieving 80% of the calorie goals within the first 72 hours. If you cannot achieve 80% of the calorie goals, do not allow the cumulative energy deficit to go up. Use partial parenteral nutrition support to bridge the gap so as to reduce the morbidity and mortality into intensive care units and neurotrauma units. So this is my take-home message. So please feed your patients right from the start and assess it on admission with the Nutri-Score and start feeding them early so as to have good outcomes and good recovery. Thank you very much.